civic worlds, political worlds, academic disciplinary worlds, religious worlds. And the question for children is, how do they learn to navigate the boundaries of these worlds, climb into them as owners, as having the privilege to explore them and be part of them? That's the core. If you're poor or you're an outsider, research has shown that you see the world as this homogeneous, distant place where you don't belong. You can see this in Latino communities in this area. Respect and privilege. They respect the school systems, but they assume that that world will take care of their children. They are not able to crawl into it and take active roles in it in too many cases. So the challenge of this psychological work is, how do we help kids enter different social worlds and navigate the boundaries of those worlds in ways in which they can master the expertise, feel capable? That's the core of the work. And when you go out and you spend as much time in high poverty schools as I do, what you see is a Kafkaesque universe of these degraded social worlds where kids are engaged in compliance activities. Supposedly it's science class and they're memorizing vocabulary for bubble tests. That's really the challenge. And without modern psychological theory, so how does a psychological, this is not what I was going to talk about, but you inspired me, Eduardo. I started my career as a landscape designer and architect. And in Japanese landscapes, when you enter a house, there's a genkan, which is a recessed area. When you turn around, you take your shoes off, and before you enter the house, you point your shoes into the house to mark that you're entering into a new social world. The biggest use of these strategies is to actually design environments in which students know how to enter these new social worlds that are demanding intellectually, that they have the confidence and they have the skills to really do it. We know that these theories work by allowing children to suspend belief about what they can and can't do, so they give them a chance, and you know the Walton Yeager great research papers, and to allow a recursive cycle of achievement to take place. Otherwise, you get a degrading cycle of disengagement. So these particular psychological skills are critical for educational architects. They're only incidentally valuable for jumping up math scores in dysfunctional environments. They're key for the design of new educational environments. And that's what the Common Core, notice that segue there, and that's what the Common Core is going to require. So I thought I would, because you're education leaders and philanthropists, I'd start by showing you what the problems were that the Common Core was created to solve. Much better to understand the problem. Einstein used to say, when working on a hard problem, make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. And absolutely make sure you're working on the right problem. Don't be blinded by the solutions. Right. In 2008, when the Common Core was envisioned, the National Governors Association was facing an economic crisis. They had gotten bad news about declining American competitiveness, and a series of reports came out on the character of schooling that were extremely dismaying. One, the widget effect by the New Teacher Project, which showed that 99.1% of teachers in urban districts were rated satisfactory or better than average. And you can literally name the teachers who were rated unsatisfactory. So fears of competitiveness, economic crisis, negative reports on schooling, and a populist revolt against entrenched educational elites who spoke in the language of social justice and ethics, but actually organized schools around the needs of adults rather than the children in their care. So this was a critical moment in educational design. The governors put together a group of 12, of which I was privileged to serve, to construct a commission to do international benchmarking. And we came up with 5 key goals that underlie the Common Core, talk about why it's important, and then I will show you the data that mobilized us. We produced 5 action standards. The first was to upgrade state standards by adopting a Common Core of internationally benchmarked standards in math and language arts, because we needed our students to be globally competitive. This was Governor Sonny Perdue of Georgia. And I remember the day when someone showed him that being proficient in Georgia was sub-basic in other states. That basically your family cat could be proficient in Georgia by randomly selecting bubbles. And Governor Perdue was infuriated and said, I need international benchmarks. My children are not just competing with Alabama. That's what makes us look good. Right? We need to compete with Singapore. So that was that's what was going on in that meeting. The second was the belief that if we were going to make change in education, we had to destabilize the big monopoly industries that shape what actually happened in school, the textbook industries and things around them. So the idea was that by having common standards across large numbers of states, it would lower the bar to entry for entrepreneurs. That was a big driver of the Common Core. Of course, they underestimated that these big companies are incredibly creative and flexible. So they bought the demonizing mythology, but they wanted to get control over these companies. The third, when we looked at the international data, we studied Finland, Singapore, South Korea. We noticed that all of them had a very high bar to entry to teaching. In Finland, South Korea, and elementary schools, not high schools there. In Singapore, you're in the top 10 or 15% of your graduating class. The government invests in you. And we knew that we had a dysfunctional teacher production process where large numbers of students in the bottom half of their class, not sure what they wanted to do, would choose to become teachers as seniors in college. We needed to fix that. The fourth was accountability. This was a statement that we do not want to back off accountability, particularly accountability that held schools accountable for each subgroup of populations they serve, so that particular groups could not be hidden in the average numbers of data. And fifth, which is the biggest related to the Common Core, is to measure state-level education performance against an international standard rather than a standard that each state made up. The governor, so this is talking at a school, but in the closed meeting with the governors, Jim Hunt, who was a brilliant governor of North Carolina, came and said, we need to band together, governors, because if we're left alone, there'll be tremendous downward pressures on the standards we set. We need to work together as a country and benchmark things internationally so that we will have the courage to maintain high standards that mean something in the real world. So what was the data that we worked with? This diagram was the equivalent of 1957 Sputnik in spurring action. The 2006 PISA study, this is an international test of 15-year-olds' ability to use what they learn in school in unfamiliar situations. We were blown away by the fact that the US, which everyone assumed had the best education system on the planet, turned out to be 25th out of 30 OECD countries between Portugal and Spain. Not a good place to be, except if you want to eat. Finland was the top country. Korea was the top country. It was interesting because Finland kids spend the least amount of time in school of any of these countries. In Korea, they spend the most. So, if you're a scholar, your primary job is to instill doubt in people who are too sure. So what you see in the data is complex arguments against any simple explanation of educational performance. We don't need more out-of-school time. Finland has the least. But there was another international comparison, the TIMSS, which tested, do students actually know what they learned in school? And it turned out, in 2011, there were only 6 countries that outperformed the US, And 9 states participated as if they were countries. Usually Texas likes to think of itself as a separate country, but our governor didn't want to go that far. And it turned out that 4 states, North Carolina, Minnesota, Indiana, and Illinois, Massachusetts rather, outperformed all Japan. They basically performed as well as Singapore and Korea. Right? And Massachusetts was second in the world in science in this competition. People did not want to use this data in policy making. They thought the threat of international competition would be more useful. But the logic would say, if you want to emulate anyone, emulate Massachusetts, because their performance is extremely high and they come from the same culture. So simple explanations of picking this from Singapore or Finland don't explain why Massachusetts does as well. But how could you get such different results? This relates to the Common Core. US kids are really good at skills. They've been drilled on them for the last 20 years. We're crappy at teaching kids to use what they learned in school in the environment around them. Finland, Korea, the Netherlands, New Zealand restructured their curricula so that they directly were focused on the PISA test. That's why their kids did really well on PISA. The message is we need to balance our curriculum so that kids persist in learning skills, but learn to use them. And the right metaphor is music. Musicians have a deep respect for skill. You practice every day. But you don't just practice and don't play things. When you're a musician, you ask everything you learn, what can I do with it? You practice. It's sometimes drudgery, but it allows you to do beautiful things. That's the model we need for education. The second big Sputnik event was we believed our higher education system was the best in the world. And it turned out that if you look at 25 to 64-year-olds, the US is way up there. Canada is a little stronger. Israel is a little stronger. Japan is statistically the same. Canada is a little stronger largely because of immigration policy, not because of education policy. But when you look at 25 to 34-year-olds, we fall way down. So ever since Jan Tinbergen's 1947 Nobel Prize in Economics, we know that educated workforce leads long-term to technological superiority and competitiveness. And the governors were afraid that we were losing our way, right, in higher education production. But here's the real problem, and one that you'll feel in this community. 90% of the, if you look at students in the top quartile of income, 2004 class, 89% of them have earned a BA degree within 6 years. Now, by this point in time, 92% of them have completed their baccalaureate degree. So there is no way to increase our educational productivity by working with people in the top quartile of income. 11% of the people in the bottom quartile of income earn a baccalaureate degree. There's a 68-point difference. It's actually expanded now to 70 points if you follow them through this year. So if you actually want to increase productivity, you must focus on low-income people if you want to increase the national yield of educated folks. And when you look by race, every race in the US, ethnic group, has been gaining in college achievement, but it's still 15% for Hispanics and a quarter of blacks. And if you break this out further, it's almost all upper income, upper middle income, and upper middle income Hispanics and blacks who are up getting the baccalaureate degrees. For low, in the bottom quartile, these are 2 or 3 percentage points, these numbers. That's the problem. If you don't graduate from high school college ready, you're in remediation. Half of all high school graduates, more in California, by the way, about 60% of high school graduates in California are placed in remediation. About 22% of them will ever get any certificate at all. Remediation is like a burial ground for their aspirations. So now California. Now you got to understand, I'm a math guy, and math people swaddle themselves in numbers